Okay. So before we actually get into the meat of things, I know a lot of you know a lot of these terms, but I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So I'm going to give you two different ways of thinking of counterintuitive, because I'm going to be talking about belief and memory for mildly counterintuitive. So what is counterintuitive? Well, Barrett defined it as we've been talking, that are ideas that violate maturationally natural expectations. And Norenzayan has a little bit different, but basically the same idea, about concepts that are inconsistent with intuitive theories of mind, biology, and physics. So just two random examples here: an invisible ferret and a book that thinks are both counterintuitive. So one breaches physicality, one transfers mentality. And I'll talk about specific breaches and transfers in a few slides. So Barrett talks about the natural expectation sets for each ontological category. So for example, solids, if you think of a solid object, there are certain expectations for what solid objects can do or have properties of. They don't allow for expectations of mentality, biology, or animacy. So if you attribute these non-native properties, you're transferring one of these properties. Solid objects do allow for expectations of universality, physicality, and spatiality, but if you violate these native expectations, that's what a breach is. So that's the difference between transfer and a breach. Most studies don't actually look at them, they just call them a violation or mildly counterintuitive, score of 1 if they have one of these. But I was thinking, I don't know, it seems that you would think breaches, in my opinion, should be more non-intuitive, but the punchline is so far I didn't find that they were. But still interested in looking at that. Okay, so minimal counterintuitiveness, Boyer says that the small number of counterintuitive features gives a memory advantage over things that are intuitive or even unusual concepts. There's been several studies that show that MCI has a recall advantage, so that there's some memory advantage to being mildly counterintuitive. There are also several studies, including this one that I'm presenting to you now, that do not find this. So it's sort of a controversial issue, but there are several that show a recall advantage. Barrett's study in 2009 shows that statements that are mildly counterintuitive are more likely to be remembered, even more than those that are intuitive or extremely counterintuitive. So I'll get to the scoring system in a little bit, but mildly counterintuitive would therefore be between things that are not intuitive, that are intuitive, and things that are extremely counterintuitive. So sort of a middle range, which the scoring system will be 1. So some research shows that MCI has a memory advantage and leads to increased transmission. And other research, which is more in line with my research, shows that increased memory leads to increased familiarity, which has been shown to increase belief. So I'll present in a second this second portion of the research. But my idea was, okay, if we have studies that show that MCI leads to increased memory, and we have studies that show that memory leads to increased belief, can we show that MCI leads to increased belief? So in terms of religion, to me, that would be the important part to look at. So not just that people remember MCI things, but that there's a way that actually people could come to believe in it, particularly when you're talking about religious topics. So the illusory truth effect shows that repeated events or repeated statements are judged as more true than statements that they've never seen before. So just simply repeating an event, a story about an event, makes it seem more true. Marsh, Mead, and Roediger showed that this false information then actually becomes part of their semantic memory. They might use this information that's been repeated. You all have the experience, you've probably seen a legal show where they say, strike that from the record, and you think, well, it's already out there. It still made a difference. It's that kind of idea that once it's out there, even if it's false, people think, oh, I've heard that somewhere. Okay? So I looked at this, not for MCI in this study. I published this paper last year. I made up a bunch of false news stories, just random things that never happened, but I wrote about them as if they were from a newspaper. And some of the participants would read the story once and then answer questions about just the headline version of it. And then other students or other participants wouldn't read those stories first, but they'd just answer the same questions about them. And what I found was basically stories that were repeated, people thought were true. Not only did they think they were true, they thought they were more plausible, they thought they were more believable. And for this study, they actually told me that they remembered hearing about these stories that I made up on the news. So not only are they believing in these stories that were just repeated, which is a version of the illusory truth effect, but now they also have an actual memory of hearing about it somewhere else. Okay. So this is just the data from mine showing Plausibility increases just by one exposure to the news story. Truthfulness, they obviously know more because they've seen it more, but then they also think that they've heard it somewhere else. And this is after simply one exposure. So my question that I mentioned previously, I'm trying to link these two areas together. So if MCI leads to increased memory leads to increased familiarity, and increased familiarity leads to increased belief, will MCI lead to increased belief? Is this why people believe in religion? Because they're mildly counterintuitive? Does this aid in any way belief in religious ideas? So the current study questions is basically, would the illusory truth effect hold for MCI? So the topics that people have used for illusory truth effect have often been novel ideas, so things they hadn't heard before, or just false information. So repeating a person's name over and over again, people think they're famous, but it's not MCI. There's nothing odd or unusual or counterintuitive about this. It's just old versus new. So would this work for mildly counterintuitive information? Would people show more interest in MCI stories? Would they find them more interesting? Would they want to know more about it? Would they be more likely to say that this is something I would discuss outside of this experiment? And would people rate their memories higher for MCI stories than for ones given either a 0 or a 2? So in particular, some of the nitty-gritty of the statistics that I'm looking at is not only am I looking at these big questions, but I'm also interested in how ratings compare for MCI scores of 0, 1, then I'll show you what mixed is in a second, and 2, and how would they compare for breaches and transfers and for the different ontological categories that I'm going to look at. So I got a lot of data, so I'm trying. Okay, so the current study compares belief in novel MCI to ones that they read about before. So they'll either hear the headline for the first time with an MCI headline, they'll have read a story about it before, they're going to compare it. So this is comparing a within participant. I'm also going to vary the levels of MCI, and this is also compared within participant. Each participant will get a 0, 1, a 1, 1, a mixed 1, and a 2. But then I'm going to look for other things like differences between breach and transfers, differences between order effects, those kind of things between subjects. I'm also going to vary the MCI level and test for the levels of transmission and memory. So my participants. I had 108 participants. I recruited 16 of them were people that I just did a snowball sample. We don't have subject pools over the summer. So I asked friends and family to do it. 16 people responded, not that many. So I turned to my friends at Amazon and used Mechanical Turk. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mechanical Turk, but there's been several studies showing that this is an excellent tool for data collection, that the data is very similar and representative as studies collected on the average population. The education level for the participants were university graduates. About half came from India and half came from the United States. I pay 30 cents, which is an expensive pay. Some of mine pay 10, so you can see a lot of them came from India, but even people from the US thought 30 cents for 15 to 20 minutes worth of work was worth doing, so hey. About half and half men and women, which is more representative than I normally get when I use my psychology students, which is almost all women. And I also had a variety of age groups. So I was pretty happy with the demographics. Normally I only have one country and one gender and one age, so this was better than I can get at Central. Okay, so the materials were these stories. I presented them as news stories. I keep calling them students because I'm so used to researching on students. The participants were told that they were reading about news stories from a variety of sources. And I varied, as I said, the MCI score and the ontological category. I based the ratings on Barrett's 2008 coding, and I had what I'm calling 4 kind of MCI categories, but you can see that within each of the category, I actually have 2 subsets. So for an MCI score of 0, I used the just basic, intuitive, nothing odd about these stories at all. But then I also used stories that were not technically counterintuitive, but were counter-schematic, so things that were really odd, but true. And then I used, for my minimally counterintuitive, a story that contained 1 transfer or 1 breach. And each of these 2 levels here is what I would compare between subjects. These 4 is what each participant had. I then had a mixed group. The last 2 groups are actually both MCI scores of 2, but I have 2 different kinds. either double transfer, double breach, or mix 1 and 1, and I counterbalance the order. So either transfer was presented first or the breach was presented first. I also used ontological categories for animal, person, and a solid object. And each of the 8 levels that I just presented had these 3 different stories, so I had 24 different stories. I know you're not going to read this, and I don't expect you to, but these are just samples just to throw up there, a visual here. The new stories each had 80 words, so they were all exactly 80 words. So an example of an MCI of 0, which is counter-schematic, is a person with multiple DNA. So this is actually true, and I think actually, Rob, this came out from an Emory lab. I went to Emory, and I read this in a couple of different sources. So I looked up things that were unusual. A refrigerator made of goo, which was in National Geographic, and you just stick your hand in and pull stuff out of this gel, and this is supposedly the refrigerator of the future. Things that sound really weird but are actually true. That would be an example of my MCI. It would still score 0 on the MCI scale, but these are weird things. These are not intuitive. An example of an MCI 1 of a breach would be a cat that can walk through walls. So I wrote a whole story about this cat, Harvey the cat, who can walk through the walls. Some have 9 lives, but he jumps over. He doesn't have to jump over the wall. He can just walk right through it. Or an example of a transfer and a breach would be a table that can read and plant thoughts in people's minds. So these are just examples of stories and how I combined them to make up my 24 different stories. Okay, so it was an online administration. Everybody got a link that brought them back to a Qualtrics survey. And Qualtrics is awesome. I love Qualtrics. It randomizes everything for you. It keeps track of which stories they read, and then they make sure you get a control item that's not one of the ones they read and pairs it up and all. It's awesome. So they got a link to Qualtrics. And as I mentioned, my IVs before, the levels of MCI, the ontological categories, and then just old versus new. Were these the stories that they saw and read about first, or are they just seeing the headline? So participants read 4 stories. They were asked to come up with a headline. Basically, these are all manipulation checks. I want to make sure that the headline looks something like the topic of the, if they read the Harvey the cat story and they write something about a goldfish, well, that guy's clearly not paying attention. So this was to make sure they're reading the stories, they're summarizing the main points of the stories, and they're really paying attention before they move on. They were asked to judge the source. So is this like from a tabloid? Was this something that was in a scientific journal? Where did they think this came from? And also rate their interest. I gave them a filler task, a bunch of logic problems, basically just to sort of shift gears for a second. And then I asked them to rate 4 old stories and 4 new stories. They were given the descriptive titles only, like these questions are all about the cat who can walk through walls. And they were doing it on several variables, such as ratings of truthfulness, memory, plausibility, how much they wanted to know more, how likely they were to discuss it, source judgments, etc. Okay, so results. First, would the illusory truth effect hold? So repeating these MCI, does it make a difference? Will they increase? And the answer everywhere was basically yes. I'll show you slides in a second. All MCI levels, whether they were intuitive, non-intuitive, totally counterintuitive, they all increased belief on pretty much everything by exposing them. How would the ratings compare for the different levels of MCI? No difference. Okay? The only thing that I found that was slightly different was that the MCI of 0 showed more change compared to the other ones. So after reading about them, they thought they were more believable, truthful, etc., if they were MCI of 0. So here's the different plausibility ratings. You can see here, this is without exposure, previous exposure in blue, with exposure in red, everything goes up. So just by reading it once, they rate them as more plausible, they rate them as more truthful, but I don't find any difference between MCI 1 does not seem to have any special property. Okay, how would breach versus transfer compare? And how would animals versus people versus objects compare? Analyzing these, basically found nothing. There's no difference on animal, person, or object, or transfers or breaches, which I thought was actually odd because I still think breaches to me seem more weird. But it didn't seem that they were making any distinction between even 1, 2, or 3. So I guess a transfer and a breach really isn't that different compared to a 1 versus 2. Okay, so would they show more interest in the MCI stories? Would they be more likely to want to discuss and know more about them? What I found here was, again, an effective exposure. So stories that they were exposed to are the ones that they wanted to talk more about. So exposing them to an extremely counterintuitive story made them want to talk about it more than before they were exposed. So exposure seems to be the key here. Exposure seems to increase truthfulness, ratings, believability, wanting to discuss it, wanting to know more, but the level of MCI didn't matter. Same thing for wanting to know more. Effective exposure, no effective level. No effective breach versus transfer, no effective animal person object. Okay? So would people rate their memories? I haven't actually gone through and coded all of their fill in the blank, give me all the details stuff. This is just their personal assessment of how they feel they remembered it. Again, you see an increase for exposure. They remember more when they actually read it than when they're just reading the title, but no effect for level of MCI. No effect for breach transfer, no effect for animal person object. So basically, exposure seems to me to be the key to get ideas to spread, to get people to talk about them. You need to talk about them. You need to expose people to them, and that's how religious ideas, at least based on these results, seem to get propagated. It doesn't, in my opinion, at least from the results here, matter the level of counterintuitiveness. It's more exposure to them than a counterintuitiveness. So, concerns. I did not go back and test all of these people long term. So this was just a few minutes later, they're answering questions. Some studies have shown that long term, maybe this pops up like the von Restorff effect, the distinctiveness. But to me, even that wouldn't be MCI, that would be odd. So the oddness one was the one who showed more of a difference than the MCI, just bizarre, counterintuitive, not necessarily counterintuitive. Which gets me to my major scoring issue, which Rob, now you know why I was so interested in this counter schematic idea here yesterday, is the scoring issue. Technically, transfers are not possible for people because they meet all of the categories. So a person who flies is not technically MCI. It's counter schematic, which to me just does not make sense. And breaches, if you have multiple breaches of the same category, it doesn't increase your score. It's still the same score if you only breach mentality. If you give 10 different breaches of mentality that this object can do, it's still a score of 1, which to me, again, somehow needs to be accounted for in this because it gets more and more odd when you add more conditions. From a pure logical sense, when you add more and more conditions to something, it's less likely that that is true. So that somehow needs to be accounted for in here. And also the idea of counter schematic. A snake that is invisible and can gallop, a galloping snake, not MCI. Again, to me, just something is missing in the coding that should be something different than an MCI of 0. Okay, so the whole idea of counter schematic, some people find no effective MCI with bizarre items, some people do. That seems to me to be an interesting area that we need to look at is sort of the bizarreness of items and not just the counterintuitiveness of them, but how weird they are. How do we code that? How do we equalize that? Future studies are going to look at that, counter schematic versus counterintuitive, and also test long-term memory. Any questions, comments?
Great job.
A couple of minutes over there, but 32 slides, I did it.
One of the things as you were speaking, I thought, well, but isn't it that the MCI effect seems to really kick in at least a week later rather than immediately? And so, but you noted that. But the other kind of issue that Barrett mentioned, I can't remember the article that seemed to sort of be showing up, is that for older people, MCI doesn't create the memory advantage, and for younger people, it does. And so there may be an age effect for the power of MCI on memory.
It could be, but for the population that I use, there's no memory research showing that it should be any different for those ages. So I'm not sure exactly why it was under 25 years of age. Bizarre things in older people are supposed to actually be more likely to be remembered because it's so much routine for as you get older, you have more and more routine that the odd things become more unique as you get older. So he had under 25, I think was
we've got two studies. Dustin Gregory conducted a big study comparing subjects in the UK and in China. In both populations found this age effect. Okay, so this is now a third study in which we found an age effect. And basically what it does is if you look at everybody as one big group, you find no effect of MCI. But if you look by age groups, you see that adolescents, late childhood, adolescence, very early adulthood, emerging adults, early adolescence. They remember MCIs better than ordinary stuff, even once you get rid of a familiarity kind of, even controlling for that. The older people goes the exact opposite direction. So if you put them together, they wash each other out.
So does that go against learned maturation? It would show that an age effect it's not intuitive.
Well, you could think of it this way. What if it's the case that while my maturation with natural cognition is getting in place, I really better pay a whole lot of attention to the exceptional cases.
Right, but if this age is about 5, 6 years old starting school, you shouldn't be seeing age differences at 25 if these are maturationally natural ideas.
Well, no, the systems could be in place, but then you're noticing, wow, I'm really paying attention to the exceptional cases as regular life. But then once I'm an adult, why should I waste all that energy paying attention to stuff that's probably spurious? I should have learned it by now, where the exceptional cases are. I mean, at least that's
Right.
one way to tell.
So that's to me, when you say learned, that's where, to me, the whole counter-schematic versus counterintuitive gets messed up.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
That we've got two things going on.
Yeah, because if it's an age group, to me, it's got to be counter-schematic,
Well,
not counterintuitive. It just goes against the definition of age.
We've tried to control for that, and
Yeah.
that's not doing it. The
Yeah.
MCI thing is doing it. And you should also, he's found that the agent, whether it's a person type of thing,
Right,
also has an age effect.
Right.
So that is the older participants actually, or the younger participants remember people, persons, agents better. The ones didn't for some reason. We don't know how to explain
Yeah.
that. But
yeah, I'll go back and reanalyze for looking at, because I have the age groups
Yeah.
already designed. Just look at that and see how.
but your main finding is awesome.
I don't want to take a question if somebody has a question. I got a clarification about
Okay.
what you attributed to me, or in the course of this exchange. Look, I haven't written this out anywhere yet. This is still cooking, but actually you were the one who raised this last night about these effects that show that, for example, the visual system is tuned even into early adulthood, my culture. The paper that I mentioned that Henrik and I did shows that you can get an impact on how the visual system processes certain sorts of stimuli up until people are in about 20 years of age. It's a great study. I mean, I can talk about it, but I see this pattern over and over and over again. And son of a gun, isn't there an interesting correlation here? And that is all these findings that basically show us that general brain growth goes until people are in their early 20s. And then you can have, subsequently you can have specific brain growth in certain areas.
But brain growth is dependent on experience.
The specific brain growth does subsequently, right? The famous London taxi cab drivers. I mean, they've got bigger hippocampi, and that's because they've been negotiating those streets in their adult lives. But they don't have general brain growth after that.
Which is where I struggle, because to me, experience would not be naturalness. It's experience. So that's just, I really struggle with this whole idea.
This is really important. You've got to get this right. Naturalness depends on experience.
So what's the
Nobody
difference between
else
counter-schematic and counterintuitive then?
It's the type of experience, right? So everywhere anyone goes, there's gravity, animals eat things, babies have mothers. There are regularities, statistical regularities of the human environment. Absolutely, that tunes up who we are in our cognition.
But that's what I said yesterday, that to me that seems more of a function of the regularities that exist in the external world than regularities that exist in the brain. If we existed in another universe, our brains wouldn't go back to this default that's based on our
Well, that
world.
could be, but this is the universe we do live in.
Right, but that's what, so that's where I struggle. So that's what I want to talk about.
When we talk about schematicity,
Yeah.
we're talking about individual or cultural level differences.
But nobody's
We're talking
ever
about
seen
aspirational
a person
levels,
fly,
about regularities.
right? Nobody's ever seen a person fly, but that wouldn't be counterintuitive. It's counter-schematic.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Right, yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Danielle.
you.
That's good, Danielle.
So we have had quite a few talks this weekend about comparing implicit and explicit, or there's a lot of different terms we can use. But my area that I'm coming from is from a cognitive psychologist, and really, as far as my talk goes, I'm coming from a point of view of the psychology of religion. And in the area of psychology of religion, there's been a lot of, there's volumes and volumes of books of different measures we can use to measure religiosity, and most of them are explicit in how they measure things, and they use self-report. And so I think the way I was kind of trained in my grad school was really to kind of use reaction time as a measure for a lot of different things. And so I've kind of carried that over into what I do now. And so I do a lot of implicit measures using reaction time. And then also in the last 5-6 years, I've also started doing some neurophysiological measures measuring ERPs, event-related potentials. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But what I'd like to do today is to talk about a study I did, which actually has a lot of variables, but I'll call it one study, in which I wanted to look at how do people's attitudes towards God, about whether God is really kind of more positive attitudes versus negative attitudes, how will these differ if we measure them explicitly, implicitly, or by using some of these neurophysiological measures? And then if they do differ, what does that mean if they differ? And so let's talk about some of the measures I used. As far as the explicit measures, I used something called the God adjective checklist. This was really kind of the main measure that I'm going to talk about today. And all that is it's a questionnaire that's been developed which has maybe about 25 positive and 25 negative adjectives which you rate on a Likert scale as far as how much do you agree these are like God. And so the positive words might be loving, trustworthy, and then the negative words might be vindictive or punishing or something like that. And you rate on the scale how much you think that these things are true of God in your theological view, and then how much do you think these things are true of God in your personal experience of God. It was designed such that that personal experience was maybe supposed to mimic more of an implicit view of God rather than your stated view, sort of your relationship or your experience with God. And I still question that a bit, just because anytime we're trying to measure something implicitly but by using an explicit question, that might be a problem. The others I'll go through really quickly. I was working with a colleague who's now at Wheaton University, Ward Davis. He suggested I might want to look at some of these other things, such as the Experience and Close Relationship Scales, which is a measure of adult attachment. We looked at the Anxiety and Avoidance subscales. We wanted to look at the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. We threw in this, and really it sort of became a big part of it later on, and this is the Balanced Inventory of Desired Responding. This is a measure of how much will people tend to want to answer in a way to make themselves look good, okay? That desired responding. And then finally threw in several demographics, including a lot of spiritual measures, which I'll talk about in just a second here. My implicit measure, reaction time measure, was the implicit association test. It was a variation of that. The implicit association, instead of going over what it is, I'll talk about specifically this one. Basically what we did in the implicit association test is we used those adjectives from the God adjective checklist, and they would flash up on the screen one at a time, and the subject, participant would press thank you, and the older folk would appreciate that, yeah. It's still hard for me to get to the participants. All they did was they would press one button to classify the word as a positive word, or another button to classify the word as a negative word. And you would give them lots of practice on that. And then what you would do is you would throw in then a second set of words, which were God words. God words. So, and this was from a Christian point of view, and by the way, done at a Christian university. So we had things like God, Bible, church, Jesus, things like that. And what you would do is in the first half of the experiment, the God words, anytime a God word would come up, you would press the same button that you would for the positive words. And after the first half of the test, you'd relearn those God words so that you would press them when you would press the same button as the one you would press for the negative words. And so what you're looking at with this test is the reaction time to mostly just the God words. Are they faster when the God words were on the same finger as the positive words, or are they faster when the God words were on the same finger as the negative words? And it's supposed to be an implicit measure of connectedness, in a sense, between the two concepts of God and either positive or God and negative. And as you might expect, I mean, all the participants were faster when God was with positive than with negative, and that was clear. But what we're looking at is the difference in time between the two as maybe an indication of how much you associate God with positive or how much you associate God with negative. So we measured reaction time, accuracy, and then also the ERPs, the event-related potentials. And I wish, we're supposed to do 15 minutes here. I could probably spend 15 minutes on this. But event-related potentials, the way that we calculate this, you measure continuous EEG activity from the scalp. And what you do is in order to do ERPs, their event-related potentials, is what we're looking at is just maybe 1 second window after you present a stimulus, what's going on in the brain after that. And in order to get some good readings of what's going on in the brain, you have to do multiple trials. And so that's what's shown up on the screen here, that if you take any individual trial, you're not going to get a whole lot of readable data. But when you do multiple trials and average them together, then, well, you never get anything that looks as good as the pictures that are drawn. But you get something that looks more or less like that. And then each of these different components, wave components, has a different cognitive strategy that tends to be associated with them. So, for example, this is the actual average data for all my subjects for when they associated God with the positive words versus when they associated God with the negative words. And you can see these different components. The ones I looked at one was the in-to wave, and I'll explain these in just a second. And basically, you just measure the average amplitudes in those ranges here. And then we did something called the P2. We won't get into all of these. The N400, and then the LPP. And as far as the meaningfulness of these, I put an asterisk by the N2 because this is the one we're going to talk about today. I didn't have enough time to talk about all of them. But the N2 is a measure of response conflict or response inhibition. So if you got a larger amplitude, N2 amplitude, by the way, in ERP research, negative goes up, which nobody could ever figure out. Nobody's given me a good explanation other than that's all the way it's been done forever. So, but a larger N2 would mean you're having a more difficult time, I would say, pressing the button, okay, when it comes to pressing the button for God when it's on that finger, let's say the negative finger versus the positive finger. And the way we analyzed it at the bottom here is each of these, the data that we used was actually just a subtraction of the God negative amplitudes minus the God positive amplitudes. Now this makes it really tricky to interpret the results, because if we go back to this, notice that the amplitude for the N2 is a negative amplitude. And so if we're saying that the God negative amplitude is greater than the God positive amplitude, it's greater, but it's more negative. And so we end up with, when we subtract them, we get a larger difference is a larger negative difference. So when we do correlations, it's kind of tricky because a bigger difference will actually lead to, in a sense, a negative correlation because we have a negative difference. The values are negative here. I'll try to get into that a little bit more later. So the main questions I want to discuss and hopefully provide some answers to a little bit. First of all is, will the implicit measures of these attitudes be less susceptible to self-presentation effects than the explicit methods? And that's what we're going to use, the BIDR, Balanced Inventory of Desired Responding. How will these two measures, the implicit and explicit, correlate together? Will they be similar? Will there be differences? In a sense, notice that I'm putting these in question form rather than hypothesis form, because this was a bit of a pilot study in a sense. I had some direction I was looking for, and I have in mind what I'm expecting, but really I'm kind of trying to answer these questions and then hopefully develop it into a more specific, coherent study. And then the third one is, if there is a discrepancy between the implicit and explicit measures in a person, is that then going to be correlated with other psychological measures or spiritual measures, such as, problems on the attachment scale or problems with self-esteem, if you have a disconnect between what you implicitly believe or experience God and how you explicitly think about God? So for the first question about the implicit versus explicit on the desirability, we found here you got to understand that there's a ton of data, and I just tried to pick out what might be interesting here. One of the things that's interesting is that the score on the desirability scale correlated positively with, this was a demographic, their report of the frequency with which they read Scripture. And so the more time they said they read Scripture, then the higher they tend to be as far as answering in a desirable way. And that kind of makes sense if these things are subject to desirability effects. We also had a marginally positive correlation with this. GAC is the God adjective checklist, which was the main explicit measure on attitudes of God I used. So there was marginally positive correlation, meaning that the more positively they answered about how they view God, the higher they were on the desirability scale again, which it was marginally significant, as you can see, 0.094. But I think there's a trend there that those that would say that God is more positive may also tend to answer in a more socially desirable way. And then this one was kind of interesting. There was a negative correlation between the number of years they reported being a Christian and the BIDR, so that the longer that they said they had been a Christian, the less they were apt to answer in a desirable way. That maybe there's a sense of security or confidence in your beliefs after years, and it's okay to maybe have some doubts or some questions or something like that. On the other hand, those were all the explicit measures. All of the correlations with the implicit measures, the reaction time and the ERPs, there was no significant correlation with the desired responding. So it didn't seem to affect those. The next question, oh boy, it's going to be hard to get through all this. Here are some of the correlations between the God adjective checklist and then the ERP data, and most notably the into the response conflict. First of all, a more positive view of God theologically did not correlate with any of the ERP or reaction time measures. So there weren't any real strong correlations there. However, remember we said on the God adjective checklist you answered theologically what you believed about God and then your experience. When we looked at the experience, there was a correlation there with the ERP measures, and it was really with how you experienced God on the positive words, that there was a significant correlation. And notice that, again, it's a negative correlation, which you have to sort of flip what that means. So what that means then is that the more positive you tended to see God or experience God explicitly, the more, in a sense, the more positive implicit view you had of God as well. I'm not going to try to explain that with all the, there's like about 4 double, triple negatives in there. So, I still have to think about it all the time. Okay, another thing we found is that those, if we looked at the theological views versus the personal views, those whose positive theological views were greater than their positive personal experiences. So what they say to be true about God is more positive than how they've experienced God. Implicitly had a more difficult time associating God with the positive words. Okay, so if there was that distinction. So that was kind of an interesting finding. And then another one here, this measure of the years of being a Christian. There was a marginally significant correlation between how long they reported being a Christian and then this into difference, which the way that there's probably lots of ways to interpret this, is the way I interpret it is that those who report being a Christian for a longer period of time had a relatively easier time associating God with the negative words on the implicit task. You could think of it the other way. They had a harder time associating God with positive, but I think it might be better interpreted as they have an easier time with the negative words. And again, maybe it's it's okay after years of experience and going through some hard things, maybe there are some negative things that you would associate with God implicitly. And then finally, this was, I correlated the into wave with the difference on the negative words between what they theologically believed and what they personally experienced. And I got this quadratic relationship, okay, such that those with little difference between their negative theological views and personal experience with God had a more difficult time implicitly associating God with negative attributes. So if your theological and personal were right together, then on the implicit task, you had a real hard time associating God with negative, but you had an easier time associating God with the positive words. Not sure what to think about that. Okay? If you had, on the ends here of this curve, if you had a greater discrepancy in either direction, such that your theological didn't match your personal experience of the negative words, then you had a relatively easier time associating God with the negative words and harder time associating God with the positive words. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that one yet. So one guess is that perhaps those who explicitly state that their personal negative experience with God doesn't match the theological views, they tend to have a more negative implicit association with God. That's just one way maybe to interpret this. And then finally, the last question was, what happens if there's a discrepancy between the implicit and explicit? Does that affect any of these other psychological measures? And the answer was, it didn't on my measures, unfortunately. I mean, I guess maybe that's not unfortunate, but I was hoping I would find something there, but I didn't. So final conclusions here is that our implicit measures of attitudes toward God are useful in that they are less susceptible to these social desirability effects. And that's not to say that the explicit measures aren't useful, but the implicit measures are useful as well because, number two here, they may tap into different types of processes and different aspects of people's views on God and attitudes towards God. And then finally, because of my third research question, I really didn't find any difference between, if you had a discrepancy between your implicit and explicit. Further research needs to be done on this, and I actually have some experiments getting started now to look further at this. What if your implicit doesn't match your explicit? Thank you.
Questions?
Can you clarify something before I ask this question? So if somebody has a negative attitude,
Yes.
but positive experiences,
Well,
so they don't match or something, right?
negative theological
Negative,
view is, I think, what
negative
you're
theological
saying.
view
Okay.
and positive experiences. Which way are
I
they
don't
going to get?
think that I talked about that. I think it was, if they didn't, if I matched positive with positive and negative with negative. But what was important was, did their theological view on each of those match their personal experience of God? So either on the negative words or the positive words.
When they didn't match, what happened?
So when they didn't match, it depended. It depended whether they didn't match on the positive words or the negative words. If we go back to the...
I'm just wondering if cognitive dissonance could be used, so how to explain this.
Yeah.
Because if it's something, if they can't change one of them, then they have to go and change the other one. But I couldn't remember, I couldn't follow which ones you were saying, experiences or one of them. If one of them can't change, then they change their view.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, that you... Well, and I think that is a good thought. No, I think that's a good thought in either. I mean, it doesn't really matter which one you're talking about. I think that that's an interesting way to approach the explanations, is that over time, I wonder if we compare the younger and older, if over time you use more cognitive dissonance as well, and maybe that helps you to...
you still want to believe despite this evidence you're having, you still want to believe. So
Yeah.
if you're having these negative things, you just, that's something
Yeah.
on to that.
I'll have to look at the data that way. Yeah.
To what extent? So I imagine that your subjects or participants are primarily evangelical.
Yes. Yeah.
So to what extent do you think that some of your findings are going to be reflective of evangelical populations in which juvenile Christians wind up feeling as though they need to defend their faith, versus other traditions in which juvenile believers wind up not feeling a need for fierce defense.
And that I think is maybe one of the biggest limitations of my study. We have such a homogeneous population. I used, for my sample, I tried to use graduate students in our doctoral program. And so at least they were older and maybe have had different experiences. They're all professing Christians. And after I ran the study, I had, as you saw here, I had several marginally significant results. So I thought, I need to run some more subjects and then hopefully it'll be significant. But I only ran our undergrads and threw those in, and it made the results worse. And so that just led me to believe that we have such a homogeneous group in especially our undergrad population, that it's going to be hard in this type of stuff that I'm measuring to find a good variation in beliefs and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it would differ quite a bit if I used a different population. And in fact, the problem is I can't use something like MTurk because I'm using reaction time tests and measuring ERPs. I don't think that you can do that with him. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So I mean, it'd be great to be able to use that kind of thing.
Do you think you could potentially take this and move it over to sort of juvenile political believers in terms of people who've come to be conservatives, and then you present them with positive and negative attributions and sort of do it that way, versus liberal political beliefs, something like that, and potentially get the same sort of findings? Because I imagine you get the same sort of, that's what the party does, and I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and we've got all sorts of stuff going on.
Yes, except I think that we would also probably be fairly narrow at our school in that area too. I get the feeling.
Did you have a range restriction issue on your GAD? Maybe there's just not enough variability to find for.
Yes, probably. It was amazing how many people on the positive words just answered the highest number for most of the positive words. Yeah. All right.
That's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thank you, John.
So raise your hand if you have reached information overload by this point in the day. More or less, no?
Bring it on.
Yeah, okay. I'm guessing those of you who don't raise your hand for that are no doubt anyway hungry, at least. So we'll do our best here. So I tried to shrink down a longer paper just like everyone else. And if you're interested in more of the details, more of the nuances or whatnot, this paper has actually already come out in the Monist sometime in the last year in a special edition on cog-sci religion stuff in general. So you might be interested in other papers in there. I think Justin has a paper in there. So yes, if you're interested in this stuff, especially maybe the philosophical angle, you might find some resources there. You might. It's not on in many senses, yes.
Which means you'll just literally be a talking head that can't be heard on the video.
That might be an advantage. Okay, how's that? Let's see. Yes, testing. Okay. All right. I've never used one of these. All right, and if I drop it in my pocket, that's still admissible. Okay, so cognitive science and the natural knowledge of God. For this presentation, the natural knowledge of God is code for a particular sort of doctrinal topic. So within many religions, you're going to have as a topic for discussion some kind of account of the religious phenomena outside of that religion, right? And within Christianity in particular, there's this notion that everyone has been given some resources for having some knowledge of God, right? But it's always supposed to come up short at some point, such that
the special resources of your religion, and in this case Christianity, have some special truths that only they are privy to, or that they have special access to somehow. Okay, so there's supposed to be a positive and a negative thing to say about what everybody is put in a position to know about God. So that's kind of the topic. And the frame for this topic is that I want to take a different tack in this paper than the one you often find in this literature, and in particular on the fringes of this literature where we're talking or implying something about its significance, and in particular significance for science and religion and how to think about how they relate, right? So often, either explicitly or implicitly, there's something of an adversarial ethos where people from a naturalistic point of view often seem like they're trying to explain religion away, or at the very least defend their right to explain certain parts of religion away. And oftentimes the religiously inclined folks who participate in this seem to be trying to either diffuse attempts to explain it away or establish some sort of hedge such that the scientists or the naturalists somehow can't get at religion. That's somehow buttress this tu magisteria sort of view of the matter. And I think those conversations are fine. They're okay and they need to happen, and hopefully we can behave while we have them. But I want to do something a bit different in this case. I want to ask a question that doesn't often come up, namely, can you use resources within the cognitive science of religion as a resource when you go to try to understand maybe your own faith, right? When you do that faith-seeking understanding thing. So Justin and Kelly Clark have done something similar but kind of an opposite thing of trying to map certain theological concepts like the sensus divinitatis onto CSR to see how well they fit. So this is kind of the opposite sort of a move. This is, let's take the CSR stuff and look to apply it within the internal discussions of some related matters, namely the natural knowledge of God stuff, and see how does it fit? What does it make us shift around? Does it suggest new paradigms for approaching the topic? And I think it does. So by this point, hopefully a lot of the CSR material that I want to apply is fairly familiar. Certainly I know for the people that were in the focus group that's presenting all their material is going to be familiar, but I'll just chat through it a little bit, especially for the folks for whom some of this might be a bit new. So obviously something that's been talked a bit about is this minimally counterintuitive agent business, or as Bob was suggesting, modestly counterintuitive. Apparently any adjective that begins with an M is okay. And the idea here is that across religions, you're going to see a lot of these agents that somehow look a lot like us, if not in the way their physical body looks, even if they have a physical body, at least psychologically. And in a lot of the ways we think about human agents, a lot of it's going to transfer, but it's not all going to transfer, right? There's going to be at least some respects in which it differs, and so the idea is that this is something of a universal, and obviously it's not going to fit all of the theologically correct descriptions, but that's where the theological incorrectness stuff comes in, where the minimally counterintuitive agents appear, have religious roles, even when maybe they're not supposed to. And something suggested by that, but that has broader application, is that the cognitive science of religion really draws attention to what you might call the social brain, to the idea that whether you're taking a more module sort of approach to the brain, or whether you're a little looser on that, the idea that we're specialized when it comes to social information, right? I mean, if I have a 10-month-old daughter now, and when I observe what she's doing, and she's certainly busy with a lot of things. I mean, we bought her this little desk and she uses it as a walking toy and pushes it around the room. But one of the main things she does, of course, is she practices the social interaction, right? She's just recently made a definite transition between gesturing with the hand, kind of pointing, to kind of dropping those fingers down, and specializing with the pointing, right? And one of the, if you're looking at developmental psychology, one of the main things that is happening is our becoming experts, developing expertise that's social. And a lot of the cognitive science of religion stuff is appealing to this particular kind of expertise in their explanations. That really comes to the fore. And of course, it takes various forms. One is what they call the hyperactive agency detection device, but just our ability to pick out agents from our noisy surroundings, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is teleological thinking, being able to see one's environment as designed, as it were, and having a tendency to think that, the artifacts like these chairs in the room, these are created and designed by human beings, but natural artifacts somehow don't fit that paradigm, right? But they're designed by something. And we're kind of naturally bent toward putting these social explanations into effect and explaining the features of things, in particular features of non-social things. And something that goes beyond that, of course, is explaining why events happen. Why did the hut fall down, for example? Well, it's because it violated this sort of taboo, right? So instead of giving a purely structural explanation in terms of, say, termites eroding the timber and it needed to fall down, there's at least an added dimension of an explanation in terms of motivation or something like this. There was an agent such that they desired this outcome and brought it about, right? Okay. And one of the tools that associate this with Scott Atran is this idea that you can bring a certain social schema, probably one that we've had for a long time, and bring it to bear on the events in one's world, and gain a lot of explanatory purchase, namely this predator, protector, prey schema, where the gods seem to be a decent fit in either the protector or the predator slot, right? And we can fit the prey slot relative to them, and would like not to. Okay, and a second sort of paradigm, and obviously one of the things the social brain does is that it generates patterns for familiar situations that we can impose on unfamiliar ones to try to make sense of it. You have like a normal conversation schema, and you're trying to figure out, how do I talk to this exotic species over here and ask her on a date? And you're like, oh, well, I'm going to infer from my normal experience of normal conversation. Maybe I can adapt that to this strange and exotic situation. Well, similarly, maybe you can adopt these important schema to deal with these super powerful agents. But the predator, protector, prey one is kind of a little bit more of seeing the gods and approaching them as other, whereas the second sort of schema that John Wilkins has been working on is more of an in-group sort of a schema, namely approaching the gods as if they have a place in a social dominance hierarchy, like the alpha male of the pack or something like this, right? On the one hand, they have some interest in maintaining order within already 5. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was that long-winded. Okay, social dominance hierarchy. Think apes. There we go. So So that's the sort of stuff I want to bring to bear to see if it elucidates the matter. Now, how has the natural knowledge of God been talked about from an insider's perspective before? Well, I'll give you Aquinas and Calvin as representative here. So what they do in explaining is they all take a certain passage in Romans as a touch point, but then they tend to be thinking that natural knowledge is a matter of what we can call domain general reason can get at. And they all take philosophy as a kind of integral, philosophy and philosophers, as sort of integral paradigm for making sense of what natural reason on its own can do, right? And so so Aquinas famously, like in his 5 ways and all that sort of thing, basically says that what natural reason on its own can do, the natural knowledge of God, basically consists in the kind of God you can get at through Greek philosophy, right? And it makes some amount of sense that you might get there if you look at the history of Christianity and how theology is developed in dialogue with Greek philosophy. That makes a certain amount of sense. But it doesn't make a lot of sense when you take a step back and take more of a CSR perspective and think, well, wait a minute, this is supposed to apply to human beings quite generally, right? And philosophy is a bit of a, it doesn't have the right scope, as it were. And when you also add in the CSR emphasis on the specifically social dynamics and the pragmatic emphasis on trying to figure out, will this sickness be unto death? What will happen to me when I die? Will the crops fail? All this sort of stuff. Then it reveals a somewhat odd perspective of taking this very traditional line. And Calvin's got a very different take. I love that quote, by the way. I was reminded that occasionally Calvin, in addition to being harsh, can be eloquent. That was supposed to be funny, but I only have 5 minutes. So whereas Aquinas wants to say that human reason by itself can reach kind of lower shelf truths about God, as it were, Calvin, and he wants to say that the more automatic, innate level just gets you something. Well, what that gets you, we can get into later. But for Calvin, he wants to say that no, there's on the more intuitive level, the more sensus divinitatis level, is where the natural knowledge of God is really seen, and it's in doing things like philosophy, in embracing that hubris, that we end up clouding the natural knowledge of God that we were already endowed with. Okay. And if we look back to the source text of this, it's actually really fascinating that a lot of it resonates with the CSR picture and doesn't quite resonate with that philosophy-centric sort of picture. Although Aquinas and Calvin are very different, they're on the same page in this respect, that natural knowledge of God is supposed to have something to do with domain general powers of thought that are most virtuously applied in the case of philosophers, right? Whereas here, what's interesting is you have something that's supposed to be universal. You have a focus on invisible agents, right? You have an emphasis on power and authority relations, which suggests that social dominance hierarchy, right? And on the sort of reactive attitudes that we tend to expect when those sort of social relations are disrupted and need to be restored. The emphasis on the appropriate sort of social emotion that one ought to take to someone who's properly placed at the head of a social dominance hierarchy. This sort of thing. And we have an expectation here that there ought to be schemas that creep in that are associated with other human beings and other animals that somehow are inappropriate. So what I want to suggest as a helpful paradigm shift is moving from models based on, moving from an insider's perspective, from models based on cognitive reach to different ways of relating to another person. I realize our time is very brief here, but the story is basically can be illustrated with that whole pointing thing again. So famously, in the development of joint attention, there are two different kinds of points, right? There's pointing for sharing, and then there's pointing because I want that, right? And interestingly, like if you look at Michael Tomasello's work, lots of work, 30 years or so, of looking into questions like this, the more distinctively human one of these, the one you don't tend to find as much across species, is the pointing for sharing, right? So the idea is something like this. From a CSR perspective, it makes sense that the social brain would be at the fore when we're talking about the natural knowledge of God. But of course, on the Christian story, God has no needs, right? And he ultimately is invested in wanting relationship with human beings, right? And wanting us to engage with him in that relational mode, whereas the instrumental mode is defining how I relate to an agent in terms of what non-relational goods usually I can secure, right? So the basic idea is that the human condition you can describe from an internal perspective has a lot to do with deviating to that instrumental mode, that pragmatic mode, and capturing some aspects of God, namely those that do resonate with his rightful position at the head of a dominance hierarchy and all that sort of thing. But in coloring it in ways that are inherently inappropriate, inherently jar with the relationship that God is supposed to want with us, because we lean on our own private goods and relating to God in a way that's trying to make the supernatural aid us in getting our private goods, as opposed to defining what our ultimate source of desire in terms of just the relationship itself. So that's the kind of basic idea. I think it resonates with some of the deeper things that both Aquinas and Calvin have to say. And if you want more than my rushed realization of exactly how long-winded I am, you can consult the Monist paper, and probably you'll find other papers of interest in there. Thank you very much.
Mike gifted us another 5 minutes, so do we have time for a few questions? We do have time for a few questions. Who has questions?
See how badly I confused you. Yes, sir.
Could you maybe just say again how it is that what you're proposing is different from the physics that you saw in Aquinas and Calvin, which was particularly focused towards cognitive reach as far as mental knowledge of God? Could you just maybe repackage that a little bit, say how what you're proposing is?
Yeah, sure. So on the sort of traditional picture, the focus on the natural knowledge of God is it's kind of one way, right? It's my mind trying to grasp reality, and the idea is whatever domain general powers of thought and theorizing or whatever philosophers are using, philosophy gives you a picture of the tools that we have for trying to conduct this project. And for Aquinas, this is good and appropriate.
That's the similar between Aquinas and Calvin.
Yeah. And then they differ in that Aquinas endorses the Aristotelian line about everyone desiring kind of ultimate happiness, and so that kind of de re gets to God, but it's kind of cognitively impoverished. But the achievement of the Greeks is that they really can, get to these important but limited truths, whereas Calvin wants to say no. The automatic insight you get from the sensus divinitatis is actually, that's the more important one, and then we kind of lose that by trying to pierce the heavens, right? Whereas I want to say that CSR kind of helps us see some ways in which that might be odd, some ways in which maybe the contingent history of Christianity has led to some theorizing that's kind of missed the mark. And that instead of just being a one-way, sort of how does my mind grasp reality based on my domain general powers of thought, it's more has to do with ways of relating to another agent or another putative agent, and exactly what kind of top-down schemata you bring to bear on that project, and what sort of ends you direct it to, if that helps.
The distinction between sort of pointing for sharing versus pointing out of a personal desire, private desire, so
right.
This public good versus private good. Is this the sort of thing that we could potentially take some aspects of cognitive science of religion and start to try to bend them toward behavioral economics and leverage this in a way that we can set up things like the ultimatum game that will allow us to get at something like altruism, but it does so in sort of deviations from standard economic terms? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there might be some interesting things to look at there.
Yeah, I'm thinking from an experimental application.
Yeah, sure. I'm not exactly sure how it would one would construct.
Well, I guess what I mean is
one that tested the thesis as I've presented or something like that. But I think it might suggest some experiments worth doing of that sort. I could see that.
Well, so I guess I'm just thinking about in the dictator game, we give somebody $10 and you say you can share it with someone else. And
right.
We're not going to tell you who that is. You would gain no advantage from giving anything. So the Homo economicus takes all $10 and walks off. But when that person deviates from Homo economicus behavior, now suddenly we've got something that we can call altruism. So it's sort of this leveraging sort of standard economics versus this sort of pro-social move. And
right.
so it seems as though there can be pointing at and pointing out of one's own desire private versus the public. And there's ways that we can analyze investigations and understanding of the world, and it's sort of the same.
Right.
Give people choices between these and see when they deviate from the private to be able to.
Right, although what I'm talking about is not necessarily correlated with the public good per se. I mean, in philosophy, one of the frustrations when you're debating someone who thinks that everything, all choices ultimately come down to self-interest is the way they're defining self-interest, right? Because in some sense, yes, every choice is self-interested choice, right? My choice to pursue a relationship with you is in some sense self-interested, otherwise it's random and bizarre. But yeah, so you'd have to tease out that difference of, so sometimes we associate altruism with somehow being publicly minded, but I don't think that's necessary for taking a relational stance per se.
Okay, thanks again, Adam.
Thanks, everyone.
Mike, do you want to announce lunch?
I have some announcements now about lunch.